Hello there, and welcome back to Human Physiology. Last time we discussed kind of what to expect in a human physiology course versus maybe what you've already experienced in a human anatomy course. And now we're going to move on to the next topic on the list, levels of organization in the human body. So when we think about what a human body is made of, you really have to take a multi-layered reductionist approach. More or less what that means is think of the human body as something that's built out of building blocks, kind of like Legos. Now, Legos is kind of a fun analogy to use here because if you know anything about Legos and if you played with them as kids or if you have kids that like to play with them, you know that they come in very small forms, but you can put these building blocks together in an infinite number of ways to build very complex things. So if you want to assume that a human is built out of building blocks like Legos, you could assume that you could put these building blocks together in a number of ways to build a person, right? Well, Legos are not really a perfect analogy for biology and building organisms because Legos are the only type of building block that exists. You put the Legos together to build something that's very large. In biology, building blocks come together to make a new type of building block, as you're going to see here on the next slide. So this is going to look kind of like a food pyramid or something similar like that, but what this diagram is really meant to lay out is the levels of building block organization that it takes to build an entire organism. Since this is human physiology, we are obviously talking about humans. So this is laying out how multicellular organisms, or organisms that are made up of many cells, as opposed to unicellular organisms, which are only made of one. This lays out generally how we are organized from a building block perspective. And like I was saying, unicellular organisms like bacteria, baker's yeast, because they do not have some of the bottom things here on the organization chart, like tissues and organ systems, they obviously are not really going to be described by those things because unicellular organisms, hence the name, means an organism that is only made of one cell. So they will only consist of these top three levels, being atoms, molecules, and cells. Multicellular organisms like us not only encompass these first three levels, but also the tissue level, the organ level, and so on until you end up with a fully fledged human organism. So the pictures that you're looking at in this diagram are using the urinary system as an example, and we will stick with that as we kind of go along here. So if you start at the top of the organizational pyramid, as it were, we're looking at atoms. So the atom is, in the physical universe, the simplest type of building block that we can work with. Using ordinary means, it is not possible to end up with something that is smaller or simpler than an atom. So the atom is the smallest chemical unit of reactivity that retains all the properties of the element itself. So some examples that we could talk about: hydrogen and oxygen are shown in the chart. A couple of others might be nitrogen, carbon, sulfur, phosphorus, calcium, sodium. So the list goes on and on. We'll be talking about elements a little bit more in Chapter 2, so we don't want to belabor the point just yet. Well, atoms, as we're going to find out again in Chapter 2, can attract each other using chemical bonds to create a new type of building block called molecules. Now, the rules as to which atoms like to bond with which other atoms, that's a topic for another day. But in this particular diagram, you can see how two atoms of hydrogen can bond with one atom of oxygen to form a water molecule, which, again, as I'm sure you're already aware, and as we are definitely going to find out later on, water is essential to human physiology. So we're going to find this out again in Chapter 2, but many different types of atoms are going to be very important for us in human physiology, but living things tend to kind of overwhelmingly be made of certain types of atoms, things like carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, oxygen, phosphorus, and sulfur, which is what's called the Schnapps atoms, the Schnapps elements. So those 6 elements there tend to make up about 95% of living matter. And then inorganic matter, things like metals, woods, and metals, things that aren't made of living matter, tend to be made up of other sorts of things that human bodies don't tend to be. And then if we're talking about molecules, water is the one example here, but some other molecules that to kind of be aware of just as other examples. Carbon dioxide is made up of 1 carbon atom and 2 oxygen atoms bound together. Ammonia, 1 nitrogen and 3 hydrogens. Glucose, 6 oxygens, 12 hydrogens, 6 carbons. So those are just 3 examples, and glucose is a particularly interesting one because at the end of chapter 2, when we start talking about macromolecules, the types of molecules that cells tend to be made of, glucose will be one of the molecules that kind of comes into focus there. So after molecules, we end up with the cell itself. So cells are basically just functional units that are made up of many, many, many molecules all coalescing together to produce something that is functionally relevant for life. So as I was mentioning before, non-living things tend to be exclusively made of atoms and molecules. It is the cell that separates a living organism from its surrounding inorganic matter. So in living matter, molecules will combine to form the fundamental unit of life, the cell. So cells, as I was just implying on the previous slide, cells tend to be made up of very complex types of molecules. So things like proteins, lipids, carbohydrates like glucose, nucleic acids like DNA and RNA. So again, those are the sorts of things we'll discuss at the end of chapter 2, but still an inorganic molecule like water is still going to be the most commonly found molecule in living organisms and in cells. So what does a cell do? Well, a cell is basically going to be responsible for all of the vital functions that are necessary for life and for homeostasis. So the body, the human body, and other bodies too, but let's not twist it, this is a human physiology class. The human body contains many different types of cells that are all going to do different things. So you don't want to necessarily assume that every cell is doing exactly the same sort of thing. Cells aren't just made in a cookie cutter assembly line. So for example, a cardiac muscle cell, one of the cells that you're going to find in the heart, it is going to be structurally and functionally different from, say, a brain cell or a liver cell or a skin cell. Basically, different cells in your body have different functions, and as such, they're going to look and behave differently than some other cell in your body that has some different function, right? So after the cellular level, cells are going to organize themselves together to form what is called tissue. Particularly, we're talking about cells that share some sort of common function. After the tissue level, and our discussion on tissue didn't last but 5 seconds here. Well, there's a reason for that. It's because chapter 4, which we will eventually get to, is going to be all about tissue, so don't feel like you're getting gypped there. After the tissue level comes the organ level, in which an organ is a anatomically distinct structure in the body that contains at least 2 different types of tissue. So in order to have something like the heart or the liver or the brain, you're talking about having several different types of tissue that are functionally congruent and compatible with each other, organizing themselves in some sort of way that encourages and promotes the proper functioning of that organ. So, like I said, we're going to talk about tissue plenty in chapter 4, but just as kind of an appetizer, just in case you can't wait for that discussion, there are 4 different types of tissue, in spite of the fact that there's well over 200 types of cells in the human body. Of those 200 types of cells, they generally tend to organize themselves into 4 different types of tissue, being muscle tissue, nervous tissue, epithelial tissue, and connective tissue. And then just kind of a fun fact here, the skin is the only organ in the body that actually has all 4 of them simultaneously. All the others have either 2 or 3, not all 4. So after the organ level, and the previous organ that we were looking at as an example was the urinary bladder. Again, we're looking overall at the urinary system as our example here. The urinary bladder is just one particular organ. The kidneys are one particular organ. An organ system involves several different organs that are all going to work together in some way to maintain homeostasis of things like the pH of your blood, how much water is in the blood, how many electrolytes are in the blood, like sodium and potassium, how much glucose is in the blood. So the whole urinary system, consisting of different organs like the kidneys over here and like the bladder over here, they're a part of the same organ system that is trying to maintain a certain aspect of your homeostasis. So one important concept that we're going to have to go ahead and accept now to kind of save ourselves some heartbreak later on, even though we're going to be looking at individual organ systems on a one-by-one basis, so for example, the urinary system will probably be one of the very last things that we discuss in this class, it's important to understand that these things are not existing in a vacuum. So the urinary system, its function is going to in some way depend on the function of the endocrine system or on the cardiovascular system or on the respiratory system. So even though we are going to kind of study these things in a vacuum, we're always going to want to make sure we appreciate the contributions from other organ systems as well. So just an example of that, so we will devote time to studying the muscular system, so the function of things like skeletal, cardiac, and smooth muscle. In order to really appreciate how muscles function, we're also going to need to know how the nervous system and endocrine system help to regulate muscle contraction, get signals to and from those muscles, in addition to, say, the respiratory system and the cardiovascular system, in terms of how do we get nutrients to those muscles, how do we get oxygen and blood delivered to those muscles, how do we get waste products taken away from those muscles. So that's just kind of an example of how these things are all connected to each other. Now, if that statement is kind of confusing for you right now, don't worry about it. It's not essential that you kind of see all these connections just yet. It's going to be my job to help you come to see those connections over time. I just want you to, for now, appreciate that, okay, these things are all connected, and as the course and the class goes on, we are going to start to map those connections out. So one of my favorite analogies for kind of how we are as physiologists, it's kind of like we're mechanics and the human body is kind of like the car that we take care of. And really that's not a bad analogy for a anatomist as well. So a mechanic is a perfect example of someone who needs to understand both anatomy and physiology. So a mechanic not only needs to know what all the different parts in the car are, where do the wheels go, where do the axles go, where does the engine go, where do all the connections go. They also need to know how the car functions, because when something with the car goes wrong, say the check engine light comes on, the mechanic needs to understand the physiology of how the car works well enough to diagnose where the problem is, what needs to be fixed, and what needs to be replaced. So if you're looking for something to kind of work on in the short term, there are quite a few different organ systems in the body, and we're going to see examples of all of them here as we kind of quickly flip through these slides. One thing that you might find useful to kind of help yourself out later on in the semester when we start looking at these organ systems in detail, you might go through all of these and just make sure you can identify at least one, maybe two organs that are contained within each organ system. Now, certain organ systems are not really going to apply here. So, for example, the muscular system, I'm not sure how many people would consider individual muscle groups complete organs, so maybe something like the muscular system or the skeletal system don't necessarily apply here. But the integumentary system, okay, the skin is the organ of choice there, the nervous system, the brain is the organ of choice there. And then say the endocrine system, you might want to know, okay, the pancreas is an organ in the endocrine system, or the thyroid is an organ in the endocrine system. You might just kind of spend some time going through these organ systems and make sure that you can at least kind of identify which organs tend to go with which organ system. Now, that's not to say that certain organs can't belong to other organ systems simultaneously. So, for example, the pancreas is a good example of an organ that simultaneously belongs to both the endocrine system and the digestive systems. Even though it's not shown here, it does have digestive functions. But you might just kind of briefly glance through here and say that, okay, the thyroid goes with the endocrine system, the liver goes with the digestive system, the heart obviously goes with cardiovascular, and so on and so forth. So these are the organ systems that we are going to tackle throughout the semester. So it might be good to kind of go ahead and familiarize yourselves with which organs are a part of each. So that is going to wrap it up for this particular topic in Chapter 1. So coming back next time, we will start talking about some of the characteristics of the functions of the human body. So I will see you next time.